I don't think we realized at the time we were making the film what a groundbreaking film it was going to be in terms of visual design, the storytelling approach, and the musical style.
I think animators now, whether it's my generation or the next generation, we all have a sense of awe of Sleeping Beauty. It's just a caliber of art and craftsmanship that be hard to find these days.
I think it's the end of an era. I think it's the end of a kind of animation that we'll never see again. A kind of opulence and lavishness and meticulous craftsmanship that is gone now.
Walt told the artists that he wanted to make something beautiful, that he wanted a moving tapestry, and that's essentially what they gave him.
And certainly there's a similarity in terms of the story between Snow White, Cinderella, and Sleeping Beauty. So that was probably Walt's way of saying, maybe story-wise we have to cover some of the same territory, but at least visually we can really bring something unique to the screen.
So interestingly enough, Sleeping Beauty was a big gamble, much like Fantasia, which was also very sophisticated and classical and arty.
It didn't look like Snow White or Peter Pan or Lady and the Tramp. It wasn't like any of the other films. That takes guts.
When Sleeping Beauty came out, it was advertised as 6 years in the making, which was not true, because story development goes back as far as 1951, very early in 1951.
Sleeping Beauty basically started from the early 50s to the late 50s. The whole production, from pre-production on, encompasses that entire decade.
The 50s were very rewarding years for the Walt Disney Studio. They started with a bang with Cinderella, which was very profitable and successful.
That was the time when Disneyland was being designed and built in the mid-50s, and television had come along.
And so the studio started diversifying. And through the course of that, they also launched into their regular production of a whole canon of Disney features to do in animation, which included Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, Lady and the Tramp. And these films were critically well received. They were okay with audiences. They were kind of hit and miss. So Walt was really casting around for, we got to go back to our roots.
I think you only have to look back across his career, look at the legacy that he had already achieved with the studio, because you see there in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the film that propelled him from a man who produced animated antics of a mouse and a duck into someone who could produce a film which combined animation with drama and music and emotion in a way that nobody had thought possible. And then after years of considerable difficulty in the studio, it was Cinderella in 1950 that offered a new chance for Disney, a renaissance, a rebirth of the Disney animation. So I think it's not surprising that he should have turned to, once again, a fairy story with a central heroine, a heroine who we care about, who we're emotionally involved with. And what better fairy story than Sleeping Beauty?
Sleeping Beauty is one of those problematic stories. Like a lot of fairy tales, it's about 4 or 5 paragraphs long, if that.
So there's not a lot of action, and they had to go back and put some conflict and some tension into this, and so they changed the story. There's not 100 years between when Aurora goes to sleep and Prince Philip comes to find her, and he does have conflict. He has to battle Maleficent as the dragon. A spectacular scene.
Snow White makes a lot more aggressive attempts to flesh out the story with business and gag sequences, which Sleeping Beauty just doesn't do.
How do you do?
How do you do what?
Seems to be something Walt consciously wanted to experiment with. It's making a movie without the subplots like the mice in Cinderella, and just concentrate on the reality of the story and the subtlety of the main characters.
It's interesting in Sleeping Beauty that the process of that film was a little different than most of the other films. The story seems to be pretty well set, at least by 1952.
Earlier films, you can tell from story meetings that there was a tremendous amount of refining, of reworking, going over the stuff over and over again to purify it as much as possible. Sleeping Beauty, you can't see that. Sleeping Beauty seems to have been pretty much the way it turned out from the very early.
One of his greatest gifts was as a storyteller. He was famed for coming in and finding the weak points in a story, throwing things out that were wasted, and moving right to the heart, and finding warmth and interest in stories. But his interest was drifting.
And an awful lot of things were boiling and bubbling around the company that distracted Walt, and I think probably interested him in some ways more than film and animation had done in the past.
He did admit that doing Sleeping Beauty presented some real challenges because they had used so many elements in Snow White and Cinderella that the challenge in doing Sleeping Beauty was to come up with something new that they had not done.
He was obviously really searching for how is this one going to be different than the others.
So he thought design, interesting design, something bold, modern, would be the way to go.
You know, a lot had happened since Snow White. And in the post-war era, illustration and design went through a major sea change. And Sleeping Beauty seems to have been an attempt to answer that in a feature film with something that was more designy, more sophisticated, more decorative than any other Disney movie it had ever been before.
Walt Disney said that he wanted moving illustration. That was his command on Sleeping Beauty.
Meaning going beyond the usual painting, doing something really illustrative, detailed.
Every frame in Sleeping Beauty, even if you were to stop the film anywhere in the course of its projection, you would get a perfectly beautiful, composed image, you know, just something you could almost frame and hang on the wall.
The styling had its origin in a visit by John Hinch, a Disney layout artist, to the cloisters of the Metropolitan Museum of Art's medieval galleries in Manhattan.
And he saw the unicorn tapestries. He came back and he was talking to Walt about the unicorn tapestries. And Walt thought at that time, that's what I'll do. It'll be completely different.
And John Hinch made some sketches that were based on that trip. Ivan Earle then made trial paintings based on those drawings as a sort of test to see what he would do for Sleeping Beauty.
I wonder if my heart keeps singing.
Part of the production process was this amazing group of artists who would do pre-production artwork to determine what the look of the film was going to be. One of those artists, well, one of my favorites is Mary Blair, and she would do these beautiful paintings that are just exquisite, very simple and yet bold and electric in terms of the emotion.
I've read several accounts, it all seems to be true, that Walt, he was complaining in a meeting, you know, we hire brilliant stylists like Mary Blair, and yet I feel it never reaches the screen.
There are only a few shorts in which Mary Blair's work really looks the way it was intended to look in the concept paintings. Once Upon a Wintertime is a short that is very much Mary Blair's style, carried over into the animation, and it matches the background very well. But you take something like Johnny Appleseed, which has a Mary Blair stylized background. You still have these rounded characters in front, and it's kind of a disconnect there.
And he loved her work for films like Peter Pan and Alice in Wonderland. But when he saw the film on screen, he felt that her vision had got watered down, had been made less than it should have been. This was not going to happen on Sleeping Beauty. And to ensure that, Disney handed over the baton for the artistic look of Sleeping Beauty to Eyvind Earle, a man of very, very unique vision. Disney wanted to see that captured on screen.
That style was rooted in an international Gothic, late medieval, proto-Renaissance period where painters used a kind of highly detailed compositions, such as you'll see in the film Sleeping Beauty.
I first started with the old medieval artists and almost everything that was Gothic. The tapestries were perfect examples of how foregrounds ought to be. The Gothic came from the Persians, And all their little details of grasses and weeds and trees fit perfectly. And over all of that, a little tiny bit of myself came through.
One of the principal books that Earl cites is the great Book of Hours of Jean Duc de Berry, a combination prayer book and calendar that illustrates the seasons with great landscape painting, forests, fields, and architecture. This would be one of the principal images that would guide Ivan Earle's aesthetic vision.
I've always been influenced by pre-Renaissance, medieval, Gothic, and here's a movie based on that period of time.
Sleeping Beauty is curiously a film that is Gothic, but it's also a very contemporary film in its design.
Well, it takes the ideas and the colors and the motifs from the Middle Ages, but then it reinterprets those with a 50s point of view, it being very graphic, and there's a certain sort of I don't know what the style is, sort of a Sputnik style, graphic style that happened in the 50s.
About 1950 was the height of a studio called UPA, where these
alleys. And out of that, UPA, among others, grew up and turned out some wonderful stuff. And some of that sort of made the full circle and wound up back at Disney with Toot, Whistle, Plunk, and Boom and films like that.
It's a CinemaScope cartoon in a very modern design style that is sort of like a UPA cartoon, but only better.
Sleeping Beauty, to me, was an outgrowth of this. As a matter of fact, Toot, Whistle, Plunk, and Boom is often tied in with Sleeping Beauty and shown on the same program.
I think the modernist ethos of Ivan Earle precedes everything else that he was influenced by. Because when you look at Ivan's work, you can see, oh, that's a modernist 20th century approach to reinterpreting Renaissance art.
And this was what Walt Disney saw and what Walt Disney liked. And the practical effect was that he had a great deal of sway over the film, the way it was designed.
And since Ivan Earle had created this beautiful approach to the background styling, where you have these strong verticals, it was thought, why don't we bring some of these verticals, this elongated feeling, into the character design themselves? And, this is something, of course, that Ivan wanted to create, a total synthesis between character and background, which had never been done before.
I think that Walt Disney saw in the style of painting of Ivan Earle something that was the next step. And he said, let's see what Earle can do with this. That was sufficient to let the animators and the team know that Walt Disney meant business. It was very clear. Team effort as it was, Earle was captain of that team.
The styling of Sleeping Beauty became an issue because it just seemed to sometimes overtake the animation. And of course, animators want the audience to focus on their characters, not on the background. The background that's appropriately named the background.
The animators had two real challenges with the design of the film. In the first place, the backgrounds were so detailed and busy that it was hard to make the characters stand out and read against them. And also, the characters had to be stylized in a way that matched the backgrounds.
And Ivan Earle, he was very strict on the rules that he wanted the animators to follow.
The animators were always a very protected species at Disney, and they had a lot of input in terms of their character, in terms of how the characters would be colored and so on. And Ivan actually said, no, I want to have a huge influence in styling the characters and actually do all the color modeling on them.
And you couldn't argue with him about it because Walt picked him.
Oh dear, what an awkward situation.
But sometimes his colors didn't work to the advantage of our characters, and so we had some minor battles over that.
They did rebel at one point. A few of them went up to see Walt and to complain about it, and it did them no good. Walt didn't back them on this. He wanted the design to carry the picture.
I remember Frank Thomas complaining about creating a Merriweather in this balletic dance. Almost was weightless, and he was trying for that. And then as soon as he saw it in color with the black bodice, he felt she was suddenly anchored to the ground.
Oh, no.
It would create a real problem for them. And he fought to try to get the color to change, and Ivan Earl stuck to his scheme and kept it that black color.
I think Ivan Earl won on the big points. His design is pretty much what he wanted it to be in the film. However, there were compromises. I think with the Three Good Fairies.
The animators got their way too, because what they managed to do was to bring into those characters something which was the familiar Disney feeling. Although the characters wore geometric capes and pointed hats, they're warm, they're round, they're cuddly. These are Disney characters.
I think that has to do with Frank and all his drawing style, and them maybe resisting going all the way graphic with them.
It looks awful. That's because it's on you, dear.
Those are the broadest characters out of all the humans, I would say, are the Three Fairies. And they even had broader sequences that were storyboarded. They were baking a cake, and the whole oven blew up. It was very cartoony and broad, but Walt thought that would be nice for Donald Duck Shore, but not for Sleeping Beauty.
There.
So even Walt brought it down in terms of business.
Walt actually wanted the fairies to be all very similar. He wanted almost a Huey, Dewey, and Louie thing. And they had to do a lot of talking to convince Walt.
So we started figuring how we could develop them into special personalities. Like Fauna came from a person that Frank met in Colorado.
She was an officer in a ladies' club, and so they called on her for her inspirational piece for the day, and she said, "Oh dear, I don't seem to be able to find this, but I have a letter here from my cousin Susie who says some very interesting things I think you'll be interested in." So she read the letter from her cousin Susie.
Of course.
And she was so sweet and so affectionate, but she wasn't with it. And I said, "There's our character."
Oh?
Everybody was working to try to lighten up the picture because it needed something to give it some more life.
John Lounsbury was my mentor, and John was given the scene where the two kings are drinking and talking about their children and their coming wedding and everything.
John Lounsbury was a wonderful draftsman, and he often got slapstick scenes.
For the wedding!
And this was his chance to do that in this particular scene.
My daughter yet, and you're taking her away from me.
John Sibley does a classic star turn in the animation of the minstrel or the jester. Sibley had a way of drawing that was as sophisticated as a New Yorker cartoon, and yet he loved slapstick. He's an unsung animator in some ways because people don't hear his name mentioned as often, but his work here on The Jester is really one of the highlights of the movie for me.
Yeah, they've got some broad things. But it's overall a good versus evil fight, and it's rather serious.
This movie, probably more so than any other Disney movie for all of its stylization, tried to simulate real human subtlety in the acting performances.
Wow. This is a pleasant surprise. I set my trap for a peasant, and lo, I catch a prince.
I would say stylistically, in terms of character animation, it was a very sophisticated drawing style, and it came natural to great draftsmen like Mark Davis and Milt Kahl.
It's interesting that Ivan Earl got along well with Mark Davis. Mark understood modern art, and he understood the modernist aesthetic. Mark Davis was a Renaissance man. Mark could do exquisite storyboards, which he did on Bambi. He could design characters. He could do color work in designing characters and environment, and he was a terrific animator. He was a quadruple threat. He brilliantly animated Princess Aurora and Maleficent.
Well, here's your precious princess.
You know, having to balance characters that contrasting is a pretty tall assignment. Mark Davis really nailed it.
It's incredible!
When he later did Cruella de Vil, that was like going the opposite direction from Maleficent. This is a really wild and woolly character that was all over the place, and I think it was kind of a relief to him to be able to do that character after the very stiff Maleficent.
He said that Cruella de Vil had other people to bounce off of.
Anita, darling. How are you? Miserable, darling, as usual. Perfectly wretched.
Whereas Maleficent, she just gave speeches.
Oh, they're hopeless. A disgrace to the forces of evil.
It's very difficult to do a character that speaks more or less directly to the audience and does not work closely with another character. So the one thing she had to work with was the Raven.
It was a story element for her to be able to talk to somebody. But I remember Mark sitting down there, and he had a little 16 millimeter viewer, and he had gotten footage from the True Life Adventure people, and they had ravens that they had shot.
Oh, I remember them borrowing film from us. I remember a number of times furnishing animal footage to animators for reference. Ravens were in everything we ever made because they're such a ubiquitous bird.
So Mark Davis' impact on Sleeping Beauty is palpable.
Milt Kahl got the assignment of doing The Prince, which he absolutely dreaded.
Mark and Milt both would love to have done fun things, but they always got stuck with all the realistic animation because they were the best draftsmen.
The horse is a great example of what Milt Kahl could really do. There was a sense of solidity and dimensionality, and yet a very clean graphic look to the way the thing was drawn that made it, he makes it look so easy.
No, it cannot be!
Woolie Reitherman directed the sequence of the dragon fight.
Woolie was a very adventurous man. And in art, all the things that a person is at the soul of them, that seems to surface into their artwork. He was a fighter pilot in World War II, and so, he'd seen a lot of action, and he loved action.
Sometimes when you're directing a sequence, logic might take a back seat to emotion, and certainly in Sleeping Beauty and in the dragon fight, Woolie always talked about it.
You didn't know how he got through the thorns or how his horse ever got up there. They used to criticize that thing when I showed it first, but Walt liked it, thank goodness. It didn't need the logic. You didn't have time to think. That thing was driving at you all the time. And that's what gives you the juices. That's what makes your adrenaline go.
One of the most powerful climactic sequences ever in a Disney film. And I don't even know if it's ever been topped. It is just a tour de force of action.
The film is just filled with gorgeous scenes done by the best people in the business. Great stuff that just really knocked us out when we saw it back in 1956. The animation, it was just fantastic.
No one person ever creates an animated character. The voice has to be cast and recorded, and for a film like Sleeping Beauty that relies on so much realism, live-action reference footage is shot, as well as the animation and the design. So it's a very complicated process.
There's one thing that you can see Walt's hand, and that is in the casting. He was very meticulous about who he wanted to speak the lines.
There are really good choice voices in this film. Aurora, she's not the innocent that Snow White was, nor even Cinderella. She has a dignity, even though she's just a princess, I suppose, but she comes off as a queen in the film.
Well, and what are you three dears up to?
Mary Costa is like the perfect fairy tale voice, very clean, and she had to work on this almost mid-Atlantic, somewhat English accent because she comes from the South and she had to get the Southern accent out of there because this is a European fairy tale, but she managed beautifully, I thought. And Walt just loved her voice.
Walt Disney called me and he said, "You have a warm, warm voice and it expresses love from your heart. Also, your voice is so naturally placed that you can use your singing voice as an extension of speech.
I wonder why each little bird has a someone.
And he said, I want you to drop all of the colors and the things that you feel about Briar Rose to your vocal palette, and I want you to paint with your voice.
I'm awfully sorry. I didn't mean to frighten you.
Oh, it wasn't that. It's just that you're
A stranger?
And Prince Philip with Bill Shirley is just as well a really good, solid voice.
We all had a schoolgirl crush on Bill Shirley. He was so nice. He was handsome, he sang beautifully, and he was such a gentleman.
He was a pop singer.
I know you. I walked with you once upon a dream.
She was really an operatic singer, and she proved it later by singing with the Metropolitan Opera.
Very beautiful lady. Actually, I think Mark kind of used her as a model, and Helene Stanley, both. Kind of a cross between the two for Briar Rose as the model. Helene Stanley was the gal who did the dance routines. She was a very pretty gal, and she had ballet experience.
Alice Davis, who had a degree in fashion design and had worked as a clothing designer, had designed and made the costume for Aurora.
The costume they wanted when she was in the forest, they wanted it to be more like a dirndl skirt that the peasants would wear. And they wanted the skirt to fill out almost like a bell shape, but still twist around the body when she was dancing. So Mark drew what he wanted and how he wanted it to work. And then I made the costume, and he was very pleased with it. So that was my first job working for Disney Studios.
Live reference has often been used in most of the Disney films when it calls for a kind of realistic movement in which they shoot live actors enacting some of the scenes from a picture in which the animators can use as reference.
Stefan, there's something important I have to tell you. Not now, Hubert.
They would go in and rehearse the scenes with live actors. They'd set it up with props and boxes and then use that as reference.
I was on the stage while we were shooting the live action, get my input into it and how I wanted to see them do something. I wanted it as broad as it could be and give me the most inspiration.
I've seen some of them. It's very close. For example, the live-action reference of the battle between the prince and the dragon. They have steps for him to climb up while he's swinging his sword so that you can really recreate that. Mark used to say, why make that stuff up when you can see it?
Now, we have to remember, for animators today, we have a whole library of animation that we can go back and look at to analyze character and action. And you think, how does someone fly? How does someone, fight a dragon? We have all that. These animators didn't have that. They had to explore it and invent it themselves.
They studied the motions of the characters on a frame-by-frame basis before they went into their animation, and they pulled gestures or movements out of that.
Eleanor Audley, who did the voice work, did a lot of the live action.
If you ever saw an actual still photo of Eleanor Audley, you can just think of Maleficent, because he drew very much from her personality to bring that to life in the film.
I knew when the actors were coming in to record on the lot, and so we would all watch them parade in and say, that's her. That's Eleanor. That's the one who's Maleficent. Look at her. She looks like what we're drawing.
Fools!
I think Eleanor Audley's voice is an enormously impressive voice.
Eleanor Audley was a vocal artist who had a Disney past. She was the stepmother in Cinderella and just played it to the hilt.
Eleanor, for me, is the most interesting of the characters to watch in Sleeping Beauty, mainly because her voice is so powerful.
Listen well, all of you.
Verna Felton, who had done many voices for Disney, she was in numerous films, was the bossy good fairy.
Now, you take care of the cake while I clean the room, dear, and I'll make the dress. Now hurry.
Walt found her voice wonderful, and he used her again and again. She is the fairy godmother in Cinderella. She is one of the haughty elephants that Bill Teitla animated for Dumbo.
Ladies, it's no laughing matter at all.
She is the queen in Alice in Wonderland.
Ah, what their heads! Now, dear, that isn't a very nice thing to say.
Fauna is Barbara Jo Allen, and she was Vera Vague on the Bob Hope Show. And then Merriweather was Barbara Luddy.
She was the very elegant and refined lady from Lady and the Tramp.
It sounds wonderful.
She had a voice that was very easy to listen to and very expressive.
I think we've had enough of this nonsense.
They were people you liked. So there were three likable people playing the three fairies.
What you look for in a voice for animation is someone who will give the animators some hints as to what the character is doing.
That's the artistry of voice actor, is to make it sound as though these characters are breathing and alive.
I felt that what we were trying to do as artists with pencils, we were trying to measure up to some standard that had already been set by the voices.
Sleeping Beauty has made such a difference in my life. I have met so many marvelous people, animators, directors, producers, and being Sleeping Beauty, I am treated so royally. It's been a once-upon-a-dream experience.
And now to make a lovely dress fit to grace a fair princess.
Oh, you darlings. This is the happiest day of my life.
Maleficent doesn't know anything about love or kindness. I'd like to turn her into a fat old hop toad.
Well, in that event, I'd best be on my way.
Stand back, you fools!
Walt Disney wanted this film to stand out from his other films, and Walt's wanting this classical score behind the whole film set it apart.
Our inspiration for Sleeping Beauty was this wonderful score written more than 75 years ago by Peter Tchaikovsky for his ballet version of the fairy tale.
When you see Sleeping Beauty, you hear Tchaikovsky. When I hear Tchaikovsky's ballet music, now I see Disney's Sleeping Beauty. It's almost impossible now to separate the imagery of Sleeping Beauty from the music of Tchaikovsky. It's almost as though they were meant to be seen and heard together. They live together in a way that I think obliterates the ballet form.
I think it was the elegant and stately style of Ivan Durrell's drawings that pushed the studio away from a traditional Disney song score and to the more elegant and stately ballet by Tchaikovsky. Originally, they had a Sammy Fain score all written out for this film.
They tried some songs. There was one about today is going to be a holiday for gentlemen and scalawags and so forth.
Sammy Fain and Jack Lawrence had written a song called I Happen to Have a Picture.
Now it happens I have a picture.
Where proud fathers in today's world would pull out their wallets and unfold a bunch of photos of their babies. King Hubert and King Stephen, of course, bring out paintings or a painting in progress.
I suspect Walt realized pretty early on that that kind of Broadway pop tune sentiment wouldn't fit into that world. That if you're creating this kind of stylized beauty that it has to flow into all the other areas of the production.
And at the end, only one of those songs from the Sammy Fame score survived, and that was Once Upon a Dream.
I know you, I walked with you once upon a dream.
Sleeping Beauty is, of course, one of the great storybook ballets, one of the great classical ballets, and animation, like ballet, is a form of choreographed motion. Everything is planned, its rhythms are worked out and discussed, just as fine dance is.
I think the choice was perfect. There wasn't anything that Walt could think of that he couldn't find in that score. George Bruns did a remarkable adaptation of the music for the film.
George was an in-house composer, a great guy who could do anything.
It's a very pretty score that George Bruns could then take and experiment with, recut, riff on the melodies the way the artists were laying off Gothic art.
I think with the Tchaikovsky music, I remember that we would listen to that, da-dum, da-da-da-da-dum. We would listen to that to get you the feeling of what you were trying to do with your drawings. It was magnificent music.
It's as though Tchaikovsky had been invited to write the music for this film and had just created a Disney score.
Not bad, you know. Is he still available?
It had a new stereo sound system in the film.
They went to a state-of-the-art facility in Germany to record in stereo the score for Sleeping Beauty.
Walt was determined to make Sleeping Beauty a different kind of animated film. He instructed his crews to develop new methods of telling the story, of photographing it, using the music properly. So it resulted in a number of innovations.
Walt said there's a new process called Technorama, and it's a 70mm frame, not running this way, but running horizontally. And I can put Sleeping Beauty on that and widen it out, and it'll be the most breathtaking way I've ever seen animation on the screen.
So what it did for us, you know, down in the trenches, it meant that we had to work on very large sheets of paper, and they were just awkward to work with because an animation artist has to flip the drawings back and forth, roll the pages to see the action. And when you've got a paper the size of a bed sheet and you're trying to work on these little characters on these gigantic sheets of paper, that became a minor problem for us. But that's the format that they wanted to go with.
Because of that, the staging of many of the shots had to become very much like a pageant. I mean, it's one beautiful sequence after another beautiful sequence after another beautiful sequence.
They really used the screen to advantage. There's a wonderful scene where Maleficent's up in the castle and she's over to the left side of the screen and she shoots her lightning bolts straight across the screen. You follow the action. It's quite dynamically laid out and staged. The special effects are interesting and wonderful. They almost look, some of them, like computer effects. But of course this was before that. This was all handmade animation. Probably some of the highest quality type of traditional hand-drawn animation ever made.
I remember reading something at a film festival here in Los Angeles in which they listed the battle with Maleficent as the dragon as probably the greatest achievement graphically on 70mm film that had ever been done to that point and probably would ever be done in the future.
The Forest of Thorns itself is a pretty spectacular effect of these gargantuan plants with enormous 3-foot-long spikes growing from their stems.
Disney had its own effects department, and again, some of the best effects animators in the business.
Just like everything else in Sleeping Beauty, the effects have a design aesthetic as well. The vertical elements, the twists and the curls and so on, how can we use those and influence the effects department?
In Sleeping Beauty, every element is so polished and so refined and just reached a point of perfection that no one else could approach.
Each of the Disney films, I think, has its own particular reason for why it's well remembered. Most of them are character-driven and have warm, comical characters that come to the foreground. Many of them have great songs that live for all time. And you kind of look at Sleeping Beauty in a little bit different way. And it's probably in the perfection that literally is obvious in every aspect of the film.
And this goes not only for the animators and designers themselves, but for, say, ink and paint artists.
Well, since Mickey Mouse began, of course, cells have been transferred from the original drawings by the animators onto a clear celluloid. And first, the ink is drawn on the front side of the picture. That dries, and then it's turned over and painted on the back.
That's an amazing amount of work. There was such an incredible level of skill in taking these solid drawings and then cleaning them up to a solid line and then inking them. That's 3 steps away from the original drawing. It was a very difficult thing to do.
It was necessary to go through a great deal of cleanup on the drawings. They had to be cleaned up impeccably, down to almost an architect's line.
It's interesting to see the actual paper drawings because you can also see all the erasures and all the details in them where someone, thank heaven, was human enough to make mistakes which they then corrected. It's an awesome discipline to take a drawing that finite, that finished, that rendered, and then slap a cell over it and then replicate it in 18 to 28 different colors of ink for 24 frames a second. That is an awesome discipline.
And this meticulous inking in colors gave a feel that's been lost in animation. It's just a beautiful thing of the past.
Certainly the artifacts that came from that movie was a particular crest in a wave.
Every cell in that film was a masterpiece. Every single frame was a masterpiece. Well, of course, that came, with cost. And Disney could no longer lavish that much attention on a feature film any longer. Costs were just going through the roof. And so Sleeping Beauty was truly the end of an era of that kind of Disney filmmaking.
We've forgotten just how successful this film was. It was the second most successful film at the box office after Ben-Hur. If it didn't produce the revenue that was hoped for, that's a different question. It merely means that it cost so much money to make that it didn't recoup its costs. But in the long history of animation, this film stands as something quite unique, something which nobody else has ever attempted before or since. This is a film that says animation is art.
Sleeping Beauty, it's like going to the symphony. You don't have to get so heavily involved in this story. It's more the same thing as enjoying great art. People buy art, they put it in their home, they love looking at it every day. I find this movie very much like that.